pulled together this summer program, working with the fund to select speakers and to give you ideas to consider, to contemplate as you're here in Washington in the summer and as you return to your campuses and communities in the fall. In the way of thanks, I would also like to thank the Einhorn Family Foundation for its sponsorship of this Capitol Hill Lecture Series and for the luncheons that I hope will be on the tables over there for some of you at the end of our program. Senator Paul is a man who has distinguished himself by being out of the mainstreams that you often find to be the narratives in political commentary in the United States. He is, by careful consideration, a libertarian, and you know, those of us that read polls know that it's often said, my heavens, how could a libertarian be in the United States Senate? Libertarians only get 3 or 6% of the vote when they run in third-party positions, and how he has proved that to be so wrong in being elected from Kentucky, being re-elected from Kentucky, and becoming a leader on the floor of the Senate and in committee meetings for views that are critically important for the preservation of independent liberty in this nation. So I give to you Senator Paul.
Thank you. What a great crowd. Thank you all for coming. I assume you've all been frisked for fruit or anything you could throw, right? We laugh, but I think there is, hopefully there are people of different parties here, different offices, and we laugh about it, but really, as serious as debate is and as serious as the country is, we ought to be able to get along without yelling and screaming at each other. You don't have to agree with everything I say. You don't have to agree with anything I say today, but at least we hear each other out. Now, you get to hear more from me because this is our forum. But the thing is that I think that we sometimes let ourselves lapse into sort of vitriol. I've got friends on the other side of the aisle. Ron Wyden and I work together on issues. I've worked with Cory Booker and others on criminal justice reform. We don't agree on everything, but one of the ways we get along is we actually only pretty much talk about the things we agree on because we know that we don't agree on taxes and regulation, but we agree on a few areas. I think that brings us together better. Recently, the most incredible thing happened, at the Supreme Court with the release of a report. And the thing is you can have whatever opinion you want to have on abortion or Roe or all of that, but I'm concerned about Supreme Court justice being assassinated or their life. So it wasn't a big deal. Also, the person who released this is a dishonest person. They took a pledge and an oath not to do this. If any of you become lawyers, it's part of your oath. It's part of the bar. You can be disbarred, and this person probably will be disbarred. If they ask this person to sign a statement, did they do it or didn't do it? If they sign a statement and a legal affidavit, they're committing perjury. I would assume they're going to find the person because I think the person will at some point be hesitant to sign a statement saying they didn't do something they actually did. But it is a big deal, but it doesn't mean we still have to be at each other's throats. There are ways that we can agree and find more agreement. One of the principles and one of the things that we talk about fundamentally, or maybe don't talk about enough up here because we get into each individual issue, is what is the purpose and role of government? What is the binding force, or what is the sort of first principles that government should be founded on? There was a French philosopher by the name of Bastiat. He was a free trader, but also somebody who talked about what government should be based on. And he said every individual has the right to use force for lawful self-defense. Basically, I think it's the only legitimate use of force is to defend yourself against someone trying to attack you or take your rights away. But he also said that government is formed in the same way. So even though government is not an individual, government is collectively a bunch of individuals, the only thing government should legitimately do is self-defense. And what do you self-defend against? Well, you self-defend against people who would try to invade your sphere of rights. What are your sphere of rights? Well, at the time of our founding, it was very clear and people kind of understood what rights were. In today's parlance, they're for the most part called negative rights. They're the right to be left alone, they're the right to speak, they're the right to pray, they're the right to assemble. But these rights don't have anything that attaches to another person. They're just sort of rights to keep the government away from you. And a lot of people still mistake this on freedom of speech. You have freedom of speech, but you know who it applies to? It applies to government. Government can make no law abridging speech. And so as much as conservatives get mad about big tech and say, Twitter's doing this and they're being mean to me and Facebook's being mean to me, you don't have any right to tell them what to do. We get mad at that, and sometimes it's arrogant when they say they're going to censor us, and I don't like it at all. But when the CEO of Twitter arrogantly says, and maybe inelegantly says, the First Amendment doesn't apply to Twitter, he's actually telling the truth. It really doesn't. If you don't like Twitter, quit using them. But the thing is that his arrogance in saying that is also ignoring something that is very fundamental to our country, freedom of speech. There's an amendment about freedom of speech, and it's very specific towards government, that government cannot restrict your speech. It doesn't say anything about private parties. But the implication that this was our First Amendment mean that our founding fathers thought it was speech itself was pretty important. So even though Twitter has every right to censor people if it wants, for someone like me, I don't really want to be associated with people who want to censor speech, on the right or the left. One of the beauties of being young is to embrace all kinds of ideas, juggle them, and figure it out on your own. That was what college was supposed to be about. Until we got to a point where people said, oh no, these people shouldn't be allowed to hear these ideas because these ideas are wrong. These ideas are disinformation. Well, one man's disinformation is another man's information, or a woman. The devil's in the detail. The devil's in the definition of what is information and disinformation. So I think it's very dangerous to live in a time when people are going to say what is good speech and what is bad speech. There's a writer who I think would probably consider himself to be liberal. He writes sometimes for Rolling Stone, and I like the way he put it about speech. He writes, if I can find it, this is from Matt Taibbi, and he puts it this way. He says, the traditional liberal approach to the search for truth, which stresses skepticism and free-flowing debate, is giving way to a reactionary movement that Plato himself would have loved, one that believed that knowledge is too dangerous for the rabble and must be tightly regulated by the priesthood of experts. This movement that he talks about, he describes as anti-democratic, un-American, and naturally unites the residents of even the most extreme opposite ends of our national political spectrum. So we should think about that. We should have a debate over what freedom of speech is, what does the First Amendment mean, but ultimately the concept of speech and the idea of open and thorough debate, of having open-minded debate in our country is really important, no matter which side you are of an issue. Now some have said, well, the big tech is a public forum. They're a common carrier, and they need to be regulated like a utility. I couldn't disagree more. That's been Clarence Thomas's position, but I don't accept it. I say turn the channel. So for example, when YouTube came to me and they said that you can't say that on YouTube, I quit YouTube ultimately. I probably would quit the others, I just haven't decided to yet. But I quit YouTube because I said, well, they did two things. One, they took a speech that I made on the Senate floor. Actually, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court censored me too. It's the first time probably ever. When you have an impeachment, you don't get to talk. The only time politicians aren't allowed to talk, which is probably something we should do more, right? But anyway, the senators aren't allowed to say a word, but you can write a question. So I wrote my question during the first impeachment of Trump, and I said, I would like to know when the group of people that worked in the White House began discussing the impeachment. And these group of people involved the Vindman twins, most of the attorneys that worked for Adam Schiff that were at the impeachment table, and a guy named Chiarmella. And like, oh no, you can't say that. That's the so-called whistleblower. I don't know if he's a whistleblower. Nobody told me he was a whistleblower. It's never been revealed. But the other thing is there's a difference between a whistleblower that reveals malfeasance and someone who reveals political differences of opinion. And ultimately, I think it was about differences of opinion that had happened. But the Chief Justice wouldn't ask my question. But by not asking my question, he answers my question. Because he must have been told he's a whistleblower. Why else can't I ask the question? And so the thing is that more knowledge is better, more speech is better, not less. YouTube, I gave the speech a week later on the Senate floor, saying exactly what I said in the question, because it's constitutionally protected speech. I can say, or any other elected official can say what they wish on the Senate floor. It doesn't mean someone has to broadcast it. It doesn't mean YouTube has to broadcast my speech. So I was annoyed when they took down constitutionally protected speech. I don't have a lawsuit. I don't have a way to sue them to make it, but ultimately it made me mad. So then we fast forward about another year, and I said repeatedly what I'll say again here today, cloth masks don't work. Why? Because they don't work. The science is explicit on this. The pores in your cloth mask are 650 times bigger than the virus. You can wear them if it makes you feel better, but they don't work. The reason someone should say that is that if someone's telling you they work and you're 75 years old and your spouse has COVID and you're intimately taking care of them as they're sick and laying in bed, you're putting yourself at risk if you're cutting up your t-shirt and wearing it over your face. The N95 masks work, but even the N95 masks probably don't work in the general public. Why? They work in the hospital area because when they go into the room, they wear like a hazmat uniform, they wash their hands, they put gloves on, they put a mask on, they don't touch any of it. When they come out, they take it all off and they throw it away and wash their hands again. If you can live that way, some of these protections work. But the thing is can't we have a debate out? If you disagree with me, you say something the opposite. But instead, you two have said you can't say that. About a month later, a guy named Osterholm, who was an official for, I think, Obama or Biden, said the exact same thing, and he was okay saying that. Then a month later, 2 months later, the doctor on CNN, who's been a great fan of Dr. Fauci, she's been for every mandate that came down the pike, she said that cloth masks were nothing more than facial decoration. So the mood shifted, and the understanding of truth shifted over time, and the debate occurred, and frankly, I won the debate. But they attempted to censor me. Had they been able to completely censor me, maybe the debate doesn't happen and we don't arrive at we think what the truth is. But it also could save lives. Could save lives by telling people, really, you shouldn't be wearing a cloth mask. We've been having this debate with COVID. In COVID, they say, follow the science, follow the science. But you know what? There's one thing they haven't told us, and they know the truth at the CDC, but they won't tell us. They say, oh, you guys have to take 2 vaccines, you got to take a booster. How do you know that you need to or not? You would have to include whether or not being infected protects you also. They would also have to say, does a 3rd booster save your life or keep you from the hospital? It's easy to tell for old people like me or older. We die pretty frequently from COVID. For young people, it's very rare. It's about 1 in 2 million. So it's hard to prove anything because almost no young people die. But here's the rub of this. Let's say 2 vaccines work. How do they know a booster works for you? They're requiring the pages on the floor to get a booster. There's no science behind it. They're saying follow the science. Here's what they do. This is what they present to the vaccine committee. They give you an mRNA vaccine and they measure a day or 2 later that you have more antibodies. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It means you've mounted an immune response. I can give you 25 booster vaccines. You'll make antibodies every time I give you a booster vaccine because it's a foreign material, or it's a material that creates a protein that your body sees as foreign, and you create antibodies. But the only reason you should take a booster is if it reduces your hospitalization, reduces your death, or reduces your transmission. Now, there was this debate in the beginning like, well, your rights are trampling on my rights, therefore I have the right to mask you up and restrict you and make you stand behind the plexiglass. The bottom line is the vaccine didn't prevent transmission, so they lost the value of their argument with that. But the other argument is this. Through the freedom of association, you have the freedom to decide where you're going to associate and to protect yourselves. But there's a great deal of debate over what protects us and what doesn't. I personally don't believe anything we did to mitigate the virus did anything to the trajectory of the virus. Why do I say that? Look at Florida and look at California. In California, they're arresting people for paddle boarding out alone. They sent the Coast Guard after some poor schmuck out there on his paddle board and arrested him. The Coast Guard. There was another one I saw where the guy's running on the beach, and he's like a young guy running on the beach, and the policeman starts coming after him, and he's getting closer, and the young guy just starts subtly running a little faster, and the guy's in boots, and he never catches him. But it's like, really? We're chasing down people by themselves on the beach? I mean, what kind of world do we live in? But it turns out that nothing we did. So you look at California, where they're still masking people to death and all the separation, and you look at Florida, where they haven't worn a mask in years down there, and nobody pays attention to any of those mitigation things, and you look at the incidence of the curve of the disease, it's identical. In Florida, some of the school districts required masks, and some didn't. Look at the incidence of the disease between the school districts, identical. 75% of you have had it. That's what the statistics are. If we measured your blood, 75% of you have had it whether you've been vaccinated or not. What we should ask is, let's say you've been 2 vaccines. Many of you go to colleges that are requiring a booster. Shouldn't we ask whether or not you need a booster? Shouldn't we say, how many of you also have been infected? How many have a positive test? Let's put that into our database and find out how many of you are getting sick enough to go to the hospital after you've already recovered. I think it's close to 0. It may be 0. How many people are dying who have already had it? Young people who've already had COVID, get COVID again and die. I think it's 0. But the CDC won't reveal this. When they revealed the data on boosters recently, the fact checkers, and this is another good reason for big tech and Twitter and everything else, everybody's a fact checker out there. The fact checkers noticed that the research had left out one category. The category was between 18 and 49. That's a pretty big category. That's 132 million people. And then when they finally got the researchers to include the data, you know what they discovered? There was no benefit for the booster to hospitalization or death for anybody between 18 and 49. Now on the other side of the coin, there are side effects from the vaccine. After the second vaccine, it's not a huge number, but after the second vaccine, adolescent males between the ages of about 15 and 24 can get an inflammation of the heart. Well, it's about 80 out of a million, but the common background myocarditis for that age is about 2 in a million. So it's rare, but it's a lot higher. It's maybe as much as 40 times higher chance of getting it. Shouldn't you make an informed decision? What kind of college mandates you get a booster for something that's not deadly, that you probably already had, you've already been vaccinated twice, and the college is making you get a third? Or the government. That's our crazy doctor in the Senate is making the pages do all this. Now, you see all these old guys, myself included, nobody's wearing a mask on the Senate floor. All the pages are wearing masks. Why are they making them wear masks? There's no science behind any of it. None whatsoever. This is the first disease that we've ever tested people who aren't sick. This is the first disease where we ever closed the school down for nobody being sick. We would close the school for the flu. You'd get 5 or 10 or 20 kids at school and they'd say, there's a bunch of flu, we're going to close down for a few days to kind of slow this down. This is a disease that's extraordinarily sensitive to age. And even this, some people will think is a mistruth, but it's absolutely true. For your age group and younger, the flu is more dangerous than this. This is less dangerous than the flu. And I say that readily also admitting that for my age and up, it's 20, 30, 40, 50 times more dangerous than the flu. It's very deadly. I know people have died. So I'm not discounting the disease, but it's almost, they say, oh, well, we need to all be vaccinated 25 times so our parents don't get it. Well, if you want to measure your chance of getting it again, whether you've been infected or vaccinated, guess what? Your chance of transmitting it to your parents and grandparents is better if you've actually had the disease. And you're like, well, I don't want to get the disease. Well, nobody wants to get a disease, but 75% of you got it, no matter whether you were vaccinated, no matter if you walked around with plexiglass all day long, no matter whether you always stepped on the stickers, you got it anyway. Everybody got it. One of my favorite, there's a few bastions left of where they're forcing people to wear masks. New York was making toddlers, 2 to 4, wear masks. And so this woman on Twitter, and there are some funny people on Twitter, she said what we should really do for these children is they should wear stickers that say, go away virus, because the stickers would be just as effective as the mask, and then the kids would be, be easier on the kids because they like stickers, not so much masks. But there isn't a science behind any of this. What would we make them wear masks if it's not at risk for them to get sick? And most of them have already had it and aren't getting it again. But the bottom line is most of the discussion on that isn't so much the science, it's about speech. It's about hearing both sides. And there are people on the other side. This week I'll talk with Dr. Fauci again, and I'll ask him about these things. What is the proof? What's the scientific proof that a booster saves lives? There's none. For our age, I'm not saying that. For our age, I think you can measure less hospitalization and death for certain people at risk. But for your age, there's no measurement, no science at all. They're proving it based on whether or not you make antibodies. If you give an mRNA vaccine to anybody, you'll make antibodies. That's not proof of anything. It's not proof that it saves your life or proof that you need it. But we need more speech, not less speech. Libertarians who look at this, and when we talk about self-defense, and we talk about that government as a collective can use force for self-defense, the libertarians call this the non-aggression principle, NAP. And it means as a guide, or sort of like an ethical guide to your life. It's sort of like do unto others. It's a golden rule. It's a variation of a lot of other things, but you can't use force unless someone uses force against you. Use force in self-defense. So it's this argument for peaceable and peaceful assembly and for peaceably getting along with our fellow neighbors. There are some like Matt Kibbe who's puts this into one line that he had for a book, and his is don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. But we've gotten confused a little bit over time, and we have a much different debate than we had when the Founding Fathers were around. When the Founding Fathers were around, they wanted you to protect people from people who try to invade your sphere of rights, assembly, praying, right to bear arms. These were rights that you had that people actually believed that you had pre-existing government, and that our government, our Constitution, was formed to try to protect these rights. But now we have people who believe in something different than negative rights, people who believe in positive rights. So these people now believe that you have a right to health care, to a home, to a cell phone, to internet, maybe free college. But the difference is in these new rights, or this new concept of positive rights is, if you believe in positive rights to something concrete, someone's got to give it to you. So now you're really saying that the person who makes the cell phone or whoever owns the cell phone has a right to give it to you. The person who owns the internet has a right to give you access to it. Whereas when you're saying I have a right to assemble, all you're doing is saying you have no right to interfere with my natural, God-given, or naturally innate or inalienable right. But you can see there's a big difference between a negative right and a positive right, because a positive right puts an obligation on someone else. And then people will say, well, gosh, if you don't believe people have a right, and I've had this discussion with Bernie before, if you don't believe you have a right to health care, you will let people starve and everybody will die. But it's not an either-or situation. So, for example, I believe that you have no right to health care. Doesn't mean I don't believe you shouldn't have health care. It doesn't mean I don't believe as an individual, in my case as a Christian, that we don't have an obligation to give health care to everyone. I've been part of it. I've been to Haiti, I've been to Guatemala, I've taken care of poor people in both my community and around Kentucky. So I do believe in it, and that's where we get crossways, is we can't have the debate because then the other side says you're heartless and you want people to line the street and die. But there's also actually a selfish reason why. I do it because I think I try to be a good person. I think most people do. There's also a selfish reason why you don't want that. Who wants to live in a community where the homeless are everywhere? Who wants to live in a community where there's abject and horrible squalor and poverty? It's not good for your property rights, but it's also not a pleasant place to live. I mean, try living in San Francisco. But the thing is that we have to decide what makes it better or worse. There's plenty of free shelter and free homes and welfare in San Francisco. In fact, there may be more there than some small towns in the South, but it seems like now there's more homelessness and more poverty, more despair, and more just grotesque squalor in San Francisco than there are in many other towns. So how do you get rid of it? How do you get rid of homelessness? How do you get rid of these things? Well, you either can say the government has a responsibility to do it, or you can say we have a responsibility to do it. I have a responsibility to do it. And neither are perfect, and neither are going to make it completely go away. But you also should ask yourself, what kind of economic system is most likely to aid those in poverty? What kind of economic system is most likely to lift people up? And you should look worldwide and compare capitalism to socialism. If you want to see good examples of socialism, go to Venezuela. Visit Cuba. I know a doctor down there who drives an ambulance in his spare time and sells meat out of the back of his ambulance. The thing is socialism doesn't really work. And you say, well, I don't like rich people, and I don't like the top 1% getting all the money in our country. Well, guess what? You know, socialism has it too. So does communism. You think there's not a top 1% in Cuba? You think there's not a 1% in Venezuela? The average person in Venezuela last year lost 30 pounds. Not because they wanted to lose weight, but because there's not enough food, because the system of socialism has driven one of the richest countries in South America into ruin. The average person's lost 30 pounds. You know what the average general? The average general's gained 30 pounds. Maduro's gained like 100 pounds. The guy's so big he can barely fit in his suits. Socialism has a top 1%, but they're your cronies, they're your relatives, they're your friends. So that's the epitome of cronyism. You say, well, it's not fair, some people inherit money in our country. It isn't. There's going to be some people that are rich that don't deserve it. But there's never been a system more based on merit than what we have. And you say, well, it's just not fair. Some people get money and some people don't. Well, guess what? The average of the lowest level in our country is sort of the middle class, and so much of the rest of the world. And there have been a lot of talk about income inequality. You know, Thomas Piketty wrote this book and said, it's slowing the economy down. Well, there's many economists on the other side who say that's not true. You can look at the evidence and weigh it. But ask yourself which society you'd rather live in. You want to live in a society that has almost no income inequality, where the lowest rung makes 10,000 and the richest makes 30,000? Or would you rather live in a society where the poorest make 60,000 and the richest make 10 million? See, it should be about what we do for the average citizen. You shouldn't care what other people make. See, that to me is just a jealousy trope. You're sort of more concerned with other people rather than what is the best for the community. Income inequality doesn't hurt other people. In fact, the more income inequality you have, the more the lower level rises. And we need to get beyond that, but look at the statistics of it. Look at American capitalism. Look at international trade. There's a website called humanprogress.com, and it looks at this. And on humanprogress.com, they say that in 1820, 97% of the world lived in abject poverty. This is less than $2 a day as measured by the World Bank. It's extreme poverty, and they use constant dollars. So in 1820, before the Industrial Revolution, 97% of the people live in poverty. Today, less than 10%. Everywhere. I mean, we're talking about the poorest parts of the world. Less than 10% of the world lives on $2 a day. Doesn't mean there's no poverty. Sure, there's still poverty, but it's so much better than it was. But what happened during that period of time? It was private property, it was capitalism, it was trade, the amazing things that happened. But you look at Venezuela. Venezuela was a great rich country. There's more oil underground Venezuela than Saudi Arabia. And yet socialism's ruined the place. We wrote a book, The Case Against Socialism, my wife and I, and in that, we tell the story in the opening pages of a gang, and there's 16-year-old girls in the gang. It's like 4 or 5 of them in the gang, and what's their territory? 4 dumpsters outside restaurants to try to get food. That's what happens under socialism. You say, oh, that's not what we want. We want a kinder, gentler form of socialism like Bernie talks about. We want Sweden. So we look at that, because that's been the main argument of the progressive left. They don't want the gulag. They want socialism without the gulag. They don't want Cuba. They don't want Venezuela, although Bernie has wanted Cuba on occasion. But the thing is they don't want the Soviet Union. They want a kinder, they want Sweden. So what happens in Sweden? Is Sweden socialist, first of all? They have private property, so they're not completely socialist. They have a stock market, so not really socialist. What do they do on taxes? Would Bernie like Sweden? Well, they've had lower corporate income taxes than we have for 30 years. Their income taxes for corporations have been in the low 20s, while ours was 35 until 3 years ago when we lowered ours to be closer to Sweden. Does Sweden have wealth taxes? There are many on the left in our country who say, oh, we need a wealth tax. Well, does Sweden have a wealth tax? Yeah, they had one back in the 70s when they flirted with socialism, and ever since that, when all the rich people left, they got rid of their wealth taxes to encourage the rich people to move back, and gradually they've actually been swinging back towards the center, if not to a little bit center-right in Sweden. And you say, well, they have really high taxes. Well, they do. They have extraordinarily high taxes. They have a big welfare state. They would be called interventionism or somewhere in between socialism and capitalism, but they're not socialism. They still have private property. They still have many of the engines of capitalism. But when you look at their taxes, the average person who makes $60,000 a year pays 60% in income tax. So if you want stuff, instead of just wanting it for free, if you want the government to redistribute the wealth and you want equality of outcome, Sweden pays for it. They have really high taxes. But the dishonesty of our system is we give everybody everything and we're headed towards Sweden without raising the taxes. So we have these massive deficits. People say, oh, that was that Trump tax cut. No, it wasn't. When you cut the tax rates, which we did, revenue went up. It's a fact. Revenue rose when the tax cuts were raised. More taxes came in. We had an explosion of spending, particularly in the last 2 years. We had $6 trillion in debt in the last 2 years. In nominal terms, this is more than we've ever done, and also in real terms, more than we've ever done. As a percentage of GDP, more than we've ever done. And what is the consequence of that? Foreigners buy our debt, Americans buy our debt, the Federal Reserve buys our debt. And when the Federal Reserve buys your debt, do you think they go to like a rainy day fund and open a safe and they have all this money? No, the Federal Reserve has no money. They own a lot of debt, which they bought by printing money. So the M2 is a measure of the money supply. The money supply over the last 3 years has been expanding at 15% a year. In January of last year, it was going up at 27% annualized rate. So it's the expansion of the money supply chasing the same amount of goods, which is inflation. It's not greed. If you were in the 3rd grade and you wrote a paper telling me greed causes inflation, I'd give you an F in the 3rd grade. But you have politicians in America saying, well, those oil companies have gotten greedy. My question is, did they just get greedy? They haven't always been greedy? It's like they all got together last month or 6 months ago and decided to be greedy and raise prices? But what about the people in the grocery store? What about the meat? What about the vegetables? Everything's going up. We have generalized inflation. Why is oil and gas worse? Because there are other factors. The war is a factor. I won't say it's not a factor, but reducing the supply has something to do with increasing the price too. If you tell suppliers and people who have the money to make a refinery, if you tell them, we're going to have no gasoline cars in 8 years, am I going to invest $10 billion to build a new refinery? No one's going to make a big investment in that, because if the people who are in charge now are in charge in 8 years, they say there's going to be no gasoline-powered cars. If you don't drill here, you'll have lower supply and higher prices. So there's a lot of reasons it went up. But the primary reason is debt. Debt leads to inflation because the Federal Reserve buys the debt and creates new money. But you see people all the time on TV like, well, we're at wit's end. We just don't know what to do. We've done everything. Well, no, the main thing you have to do is quit digging the hole. Quit adding to the debt. And as the economy begins to grow, we'll grow our way out of this. But there has to be a certain degree of not digging the hole deeper, not adding more debt to it. When people talk about different forms of government, I think there are forms of government that can bring us together better. So, for example, we have a great deal of disagreement on abortion, and we're probably not going to convince each other on the issue. But what's going to happen with this ruling, and some may not like this, but this is what's going to happen. We're going to get more federalism with regard to abortion. Still going to be very legal in New York and all of New England, very legal and popular in California. They're probably going to subsidize it. They're going to probably subsidize your travel to go to those states. But in the southern states that are more conservative and the more Republican states, there will be restrictions. That's federalism. And in a perfect federalism, people kind of move and gravitate. They already kind of do. Don't you think some people live in San Francisco because they love San Francisco? Some live there because there are great places for homeless people to be there. But there are also people who like to live in Alabama. So people make their choices. So if you have federalism, it allows people to get along more. One of the solutions that was proposed for Ukraine didn't happen, but was to have more federalism. You have more Russian-speaking people in the eastern part of the state, and they wanted more autonomy. Same with Iraq. You had the Kurdish population, and there it kind of ended up working. The Kurds had a semi-autonomous area. They still chafe at sending taxes to Baghdad, but they got federalism to work. There was discussion at one time of actually making Iraq into 3 countries, because many of the countries were created by the West just by somebody drawing a circle arbitrarily, and there is no rhyme or reason to the circle that became the country. But federalism can allow people who disagree with each other to get along. Now, if you have federalism by state, that's one thing. We could also even have it by city. In older times or ancient times, there were many city-states. Now, the problem was they all fought and they all had trade barriers, so that was a problem. But at least you could go from one city to the next. You don't like the laws in this city, go to the next city. So the smaller the division of government, and this is the only point I'm trying to make here, the smaller the division of government, the more likely you can find a government that pleases you. And the more likely that we don't have to tell each other what to do, we kind of go to the place that we feel is a more acceptable government. And you say, well, everybody can't move. That's true. But the smaller the division of government, the closer you get to city by city, the more chance there are that people gravitate to where they want to be. So I think it's an argument for federalism and not for having central control of things. The other argument against central control of things and having too much control up here is, what if the person you put in charge of something makes a mistake? So what if Dr. Fauci's made a mistake? I know that's hard to believe. But what if one person's in charge of everything and they make a mistake? That ripples throughout the whole economy. And I'll give you an example with Dr. Fauci. In March of 2020, either right before or after I got it in the very first wave, COVID, I asked Dr. Fauci, I said, what about using steroids for COVID? The end stage of infectious diseases where your lungs fill with fluid is called ARDS, and it's the end stage of most infectious diseases that you die from. In many of the strep-eating, flesh-eating bacteria or staph, they will give you high-dose IV steroids to try to prevent this overwhelming immune response from happening. So I asked Dr. Fauci that, and he said, oh, we've tried it, doesn't work. And for 2 months, the edict out of Washington was don't try steroids, until someone finally pushed back and questioned his authority, and finally it percolated back up, and now every person you'll ever meet that's is intubated or on a ventilator is on high-dose IV steroids. And now there are some people saying, well, you should even do it earlier. You should do little inhalers of steroids as people begin to cough with the bronchitis before they get very sick. I think we should explore that. But when it's top down, they're telling those doctors, you behave and you do the algorithm. Probably the best treatment we had for COVID was monoclonal antibodies. And monoclonal antibodies work best the sooner you get them. Have you ever heard Dr. Fauci on TV one time talk about treatment or tell you that the sooner you get the treatment, the better? No, but the government bought all the monoclonal antibodies. This is the problem with central authority. The government owns all the monoclonal antibodies, so guess what? You cannot use them in the hospital. They approved them under an emergency use authorization. You can't use them in the hospital. So I get desperate calls from people who know that I will try to help them. They're sick and in the hospital, and they are sick, and some of them ended up dying. They've got COVID, and they want the monoclonal antibodies. And then they're fighting with their doctors who say, we can't give it to you in the hospital because the government says no. It's like, now they're trying to decide, do I disobey my doctor's orders and get discharged, and then coming back into the emergency room to see if I get the monoclonal antibodies? That kind of craziness won't happen if you get to talk to your doctor about the solution and not have a rigid algorithm coming from government. The more rigid the algorithm, the worse. With education, should we have somebody in Washington in charge of education? The problem is if that one person makes a mistake, and about 20 years ago they did. They made the mistake and they said everybody should go to college. I'm not against college. I went to college and med school and grad school. I've been through a lot of education, but not everybody needs it. And there's some people that are more prone to be an electrician or welder or this, but because the top down said it, we got too many kids in college, and now we have a shortage of electricians and carpenters and welders. It shouldn't be the top down where one person makes a decision, because that one person makes a mistake, everybody's influenced by it. I'll finish with this. If you believe, as I do, in a small constitutional government, it is a better way for us to live together. Liberty can bring us together because I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm not going to shut down your Twitter account. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in every right for you to say that. But if we grow a government such that we get so involved that you think you know so much what is right and what is wrong, and that I'm wrong, that you want to limit my speech, that's a real problem. It really is the opposite of a free society. So we have to learn to live together, hear each other out, try to convince each other through persuasion, and see where it goes. But realize that this free economy, this free country guided by a constitution, is the richest country in the history of the world, and that's why people from around the world have wanted to come here. Let's don't ruin it. Let's make it better. Let's preserve it. Let's be proud of it. Thank you very much. And I think we've got time for some questions. We've got some microphones if you'll raise your hand. How long has the vote been going on? Ask them how many people left and then give me an update. And I do have to vote. I'm not afraid of all your questions, but the vote's running out, so I don't know how many we'll get to. Oh, here, we'll start with the white shirt if you'll give him a microphone.
Is there any problem facing the country with which you do not believe has a free market solution?
That's a good question. My rule of thumb in evaluating things would be that if the free market can do it, we should let the free market do it. If we absolutely think it can't, then there's a role for government. It's, some libertarians will say we had to have a private army. I'm not really there. I think we probably need to have a collective army, things like that. I would be fine with us being involved in the roads. We've been involved with the roads for a long time, with the universities. I wouldn't have so much centralization in education. But a lot of times it's not complete free market or complete government. It's like we're here, which direction you want to go. And I think that's sort of the difference in the parties to a certain extent is, I think our party wants to go towards free market, and the other wants to go towards more government control. And it's not right to say all Democrats are socialist, although some are. And it's not right to say all Republicans are capitalist, although some are. But it's kind of which direction you want to go. And some of us want to go further in a direction than another. But I would say almost everything can be dealt with by the free market, even antitrust. I really am against almost all the antitrust laws. You say, oh, you're for monopoly. Well, most of the antitrust laws are actually used in an anti-competitive way. Now, I'll give you an example. As a physician, if myself and 5 other physicians get together and we have dinner and say, damn it, United Healthcare is only paying us $100, we want $120, let's group together and not sign their contract. That's antitrust. But the net worth of 5 doctors compared to $1 billion United Healthcare, who has the power? Why would we be preventing smaller people from organizing? So if you want to go to Costco and get your insurance and use the leverage of Costco, or you want to organize a bunch of independent pharmacies, There should be no limits on that. All that's illegal under antitrust. So most of the things the market can handle. Almost every famous antitrust case of the entire history of antitrust from the Sherman Antitrust Acts on has been of antitrust against big corporations, but not against corporations that manipulate the price. I would think the only time you'd use antitrust is if I control the market and I'm raising the price every year. So Standard Oil is the big first classic case. Their main product was kerosene, and the price of kerosene was going down. They had like 98% of the market, but they got it because they kept reducing the price every year. So we have antitrust laws that say it can be against the law to lower your price to get rid of competition. It's like, really? You know? So almost everything has a free market solution, and I'm always looking for what the cause is. So when I see all the ships lined up of Long Beach, that's not a natural phenomenon. When I see a shortage, like the formula shortage, none of that's capitalism. It's government getting in the way of it. Government shut down the factory. You know, that's why we have a shortage there. And you have all these supply chains things going on. Walmart, you go into Walmart, you buy a can of coffee or something, it gets scanned, it goes back to Bentonville, they're bringing another one automatically. Capitalism, the system works. It was the government shutdown that led to a lot of this. Rises in inflation are leading to this, but it's typically a governmental problem that's created. Same with inflation, things like that. They're not caused by greed, they're caused by government. Yes, in the orange, or not, I don't know if that's orange or not, but.
Thank you very much, Senator, for allowing us to be here and meet with you. If you become the chairman of the Health Committee, what would be your top priorities?
I'll be up for either that committee or the Homeland Security, and I think it's not good to measure the drapes before elections happen, so I don't know. But I would say that one of the most important things to me is I started out believing what Dr. Fauci and the experts said, that this pandemic came from nature. The previous SARS did come through an animal host. They have not found an animal host in this, and they've been looking for 2 years. They searched the market up and down. They did not find a host for this thing. I really think that there's like a 90% chance this came from the lab. The reason why that's important, this type of research happens in North Carolina, and happens in Galveston, and happens in various parts around the world. I think it's a death wish to take a virus that has 50% mortality and take an unknown virus from a bat cave and mix them together to see if you can make the 50% mortality virus that's not very contagious, see if we can make it more contagious by mixing it together with an unknown virus. That's what kind of experiments are doing. And I'm not alone in this. One of the guys we're going to bring in the next month to testify is from a university. He's a liberal Democrat. He's already told me he doesn't like most of my politics, but he's on the same side as me on this gain of function, that there needs to be regulation of this. So as chairman, I would have the power to subpoena the records. I think there actually was a cover-up. The 8 virologists that are good buddies of Dr. Fauci, we've seen the emails. They were all sending harried emails saying, oh my God, we've looked at the sequence. This looks like it was created in a lab. It's hard to completely prove one way or another, but what we can do is figure out whether this kind of research should have some limits placed on it. They had a 4-year period from 2014 to 2017 where they supposedly didn't do it. But Fauci gave exceptions, and that's why he's so sensitive about this. He allowed a lot of this to happen in Wuhan by giving them exemptions to this prohibition on gain-of-function research. But that's probably number one issue. And I think then in general, promoting the idea that capitalism brings great wealth to a country. 1 or 2 more, right here.
What are your thoughts on improving the Social Security issue and not having enough funds for it to last?
When I first came, I promoted that we should have a bipartisan committee with equal number of Republicans and Democrats, and that's all we talk about, the entitlement, Social Security and Medicare. Social Security in 1983 ran out of money. It's already run out of money once. The story is Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan got together, they would actually talk, they would have a cocktail at the end of the workday, and they would talk. In the end, what they did in 1983 is they lifted the cap a little higher on taxes, and they gradually raised the age to 67 over like 20 years. Almost nobody even knows it happened. Most people are like, well, I think it's 65 now. I was surprised. I went down there and it's 67. You know, I mean, it happened so gradually. You have to do it again. Social Security's gonna have to go to 70, and so does Medicare. Why? Because there's not enough money. Even if you increase the taxes marginally, which you're probably gonna have to do on Medicare as well. I'd means test Social Security, meaning richer people, myself, would get less than I'm expecting. Same with Medicare. I would have to pay more, and so would a lot of you and your parents have to pay more for Medicare. Not because I want to punish you, but because if you really want the system to continue, It's the only way the system continues. And this is where we are at odds with each other. Democrats say, oh, you hate grandmother and you're going to push her off the cliff in a wheelchair. And then, really it isn't so much that. If you like these government programs and you want to preserve them, you have to talk about it. AARP is the worst of this. AARP is absolutely one of the worst groups in the world because they go around saying, tell Rand Paul to get his hands off my Medicare and off my Social Security. I'm not eager to change this, but Medicare is $35 trillion short. Social Security is $7 trillion short. Because of all the COVID money we spent, we've sped up the demise of Medicare. It's like within 2 years, and it goes short of money. What will they do? They'll print up more money. We've seen what printing up a lot of money does. And I always told people, it's not a debate about whether you'll get your Social Security check. Everybody's always going to get their Social Security check, and they always get their Medicare. It's a question of whether it's going to be worth anything. So if you live on $700 a month and it used to buy $700 worth of groceries and now it buys $200 worth of groceries, you want to see poverty, see the people who live only on Social Security when it's only worth $200 instead of $700. So we do have to do something about it. And I will sit next to a Democrat at dinner sometime and they'll say, you're right, and then nothing happens. But I blame leadership in both parties. We should do a bipartisan committee and we should talk about it, bring the actuaries in, talk about what happens. But CBO is part of the problem. So, it sort of riddled me this. The CBO says that if you raise the age of Medicare from 65 to 70, that it doesn't save any money. Well, if that doesn't save any money, how can we even get started if they won't admit that saves money? How can not giving away government insurance for 5 years not raise money? They say everybody goes to Medicaid. It's based on assumptions, but once again, it gets back to facts are debatable, debating what the implications of a policy are, but we're beholden to CBO who says that, so they've taken away one of the best things we could actually do for Medicare, or most effective, which is raising the age. How many? They need 2? I guess I'm one of them, huh? We'll do one more and I got to run.
So hearing your speech, you say some great things about cooperation. We need to hear what other people are saying. We need to get off Twitter. We need to hear a lot of those things. But my question for you is, when you have a government that is implementing a disinformation governance board, you have Twitter censoring a story from the New York Post about a Hunter Biden laptop scandal that has shown that it could have changed the outcome of a presidential election. What do people need to do then going forward if this is the case? And do you think because of this, voting in the midterms and going into 2024 is going to be extremely important for the direction that we have with the government implementing these kinds of measures?
I think elections make a difference. That's part of it. But it's also talking to all of you. You're all on social media. If you all got up and left and went to another forum, that affects policy. Look, Elon Musk, I think, thinks if he takes over Twitter, he can make more money by it actually, he doesn't usually lose money. Maybe he takes over and says, hey, we're going to hear all of your speech and we're not going to censor you. I mean, in the last month, since he started rattling the cages over there, my viewers went from 3.5 million to 3.9 million in 3 months. They'd been at 3.5 million for a year or two. I've been stagnant here, and I know that's probably not what would have happened in a normal circumstance. But there isn't an easy solution. It's election, it's talking, so I go on other venues other than that to try to broadcast where I can't be, where I can't be censored, basically, live TV, things like that. But don't give in so easily. It's like people think, oh, they control everything. Twitter controls everything. When I was a kid in the 1970s, there was ABC, NBC, and CBS. That was it. And if you watched the news and went back to the 3 stations, the news was identical. And it was all liberal, but it was much more subtly liberal. It was one perspective, and it was liberal. But now you've got Fox and Newsmax and AON. You've got all the conservative talk radio. You've got all the internet podcasts. I don't think anybody's controlling the speech of people on the right. And the right is complaining, and I complain too, but change the channel. Let's don't break up big tech. The other reason not to break up big tech is if you were worried about China and artificial intelligence and that they're ahead of us, you break up the biggest companies in our country that can do artificial intelligence and are researching it, it'll put us at more of a disadvantage. So big tech doesn't compete just with the United States. They're competing with foreign countries too. So if we beat the crap out of our companies, even U.S. Steel, I wish they had never broken up U.S. Steel in the 40s. They'd be mighty now, but they might be more competitive with China now. We broke them up because we thought they had too much of the marketplace. So we just have to think through these things. And mainly this is a message to the conservatives in the audience, because the conservatives are, although it's both. I mean, you've got Klobuchar and Hawley both wanting to break up big tech. but they want to get rid of stuff like mergers. Mergers happen only to find a market efficiency to sell something cheaper. They don't merge to say, oh, we're going to control the marketplace and raise the prices. They merge to find an efficiency. And then when they try to get you to use their product on their website, they're still offering you something that lowers the price to try to suck you in to keep you on their website. So, but don't give up. There are many choices, and typically freedom, the more freedom you have brings more prosperity, and we just can't succumb to thinking the government's the answer. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.